you're hoping to get to lunch early today, it's good news. I'm teaching on the shortest verse in the Bible today. Shortest one in there. Yay! We're going to beat the other guys to the buffet line. Yeah! Fresh fried shrimp for you. When I was a kid, I grew up, I was a pastor's kid, so we played all of the pastor's kid church games like sword drill. Anybody else grow up in church and know what a sword drill is? Right? It's when someone gives you a Bible passage and see who can flip in their Bibles fast enough. And there's always that one person who had the tabs on the side of their Bible, tabs with like okay, that was, students, that was back in the olden days where we couldn't just pull it up on the Bible app on our phone. We had to actually have paper Bibles back in the Stone Ages. Well, we also would have these things, my brother and I and some other friends, you know, how many Bible passages can you quote in 60 seconds? I was always bad at that because it was always hard for me to memorize Scripture. I know what the Bible says, I just couldn't remember what the passage. But there were a couple of go-tos that you always had at the gate. John 3:16, I think, you know, even people who have no idea about the Bible know about that one. But the shortest passage, the shortest verse in the Bible was also one that was always on speed deck for me. It's John 11:35. Jesus wept. There we go. That's it. 2 words. Couldn't really get any shorter than that. Jesus wept. And it's very useful if you want to win a game against your brother, especially if it's like once you've used a passage, the other guy can't use that one. We're always the first one to get to, Jesus wept. Got it. Beat you to it. But there's power in those 2 words. And there's a truth that's buried inside of there that I want to look at and unpack today that can help lighten the load for one of life's inescapable burdens. Might be something you walked in here with or somebody that you love is struggling with today. And it's part of our continuing series called Traveling Light. As you saw the luggage around us, we've been looking little by little at burdens, emotional burdens, spiritual burdens that you end up carrying through life. Things like self-reliance. Last week we talked about the burden of arrogance and having to do things yourself. We've talked about the burden of worry, the burden of a lesser idea of God. And today I want to talk about a different burden. But before we do, I want to give credit to Max Lucado. Today's talk and this series is based on and inspired by a book that he wrote called Traveling Light. If you've never read it, highly recommend it. Great reading. There are a few chapters that we won't get into in this series, so it's a great way to go deeper on that. If you're watching online, there's a link where you can actually just buy it from Amazon, but take advantage of that. And the premise of Max's book is that we have all of these burdens that we carry through life. We weren't designed for them, and if we instead ask for the Lord's help and we hand those things off to Him, that we can travel lighter through life. Well, today's burden is a peculiar one, and I want to draw out the difference to it. We see a little bit about that in Psalm 23. So we've been little by little looking at the way that God leads us through life, using Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, using that as a baseline. And Psalm 23 begins with a lot of happy stuff. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, right? I have everything I need. Leads me beside green pastures and still waters. He restoreth my soul. You can almost envision life with a lot of Bob Ross happy trees everywhere. Anybody else Bob Ross? My dad, he used to watch all the time when I was growing up, just watch Bob Ross paint happy trees on there. I have a dad Bob Ross painting. I still have that, Dad, with happy trees. But life's journey isn't all happy trees. Life's journey tends to take us through difficult seasons at times. And David the psalmist recognizes this. And in Psalm 23:4, he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. There's no happy trees there in that valley. Feels kind of more like you're walking towards Mordor, right? And I'm going to be destroyed here. And the shadow of death, as I was reading this chapter and thinking about this, I think the shadow is an appropriate metaphor for the way that grief can cast a color filter on your life. Life doesn't end when someone you love dies. Life doesn't end when something that you loved was taken from you, but it changes. It takes on a different color. It takes on a different mood. And we're talking today about the burden of grief, and I understand as we do that, that's a difficult thing because I haven't lived your life. I haven't grieved what you lost. And I've recognized that, and I won't pretend to understand what it was like for you. I haven't experienced things the way that you did. I've never had a drunk driver run through a light and in a moment take a family member away from me. I've never come home to find my brother hanging from the rope that he tied around his neck in the garage. I've never sat next to my wife when the doctor said, there's nothing more we can do but make you comfortable for the last few weeks. I haven't experienced that. And grief takes many different shapes, many different stories. Sometimes grief is not just about losing a loved one. Sometimes grief is about losing a dream. Maybe you thought you had that perfect job. You'd already looked at houses in the community, and I'm going to move here, and then it turns out they went with another candidate. Maybe you thought she was the one, and you'd been shopping for rings. You even bought one, and she didn't feel the same way. Maybe you thought at this point in life your house would be full of children, and you find yourself nearing the end of your childbearing years, and it's just the two of you. Grief is a shadow, is a good metaphor, because it's not just about things that you used to have that you lost. Grief is also grieving the loss of hopes and dreams in the future. It's things that you thought you would have and they were taken from you, and it produces so many difficult emotions. It's a heavy burden to carry, and I understand I haven't grieved the things that you have, but I have grieved. And today I want to show you that in the same way that I have grieved, Jesus knows about your grief, and he's walked through that valley as well. Watch this.
Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept.
It's a little different when you have the context. I want to give thanks to our friends at the Lumo Project for permission to use their videos. Just a quick little deal. If you have the Bible app on your phone, you can actually watch verse by verse portrayal of the Gospels. That's free. It's on YouTube as well. So thank you for that. John chapter 11 is what we were sort of watching from verse by verse. But it's important to see that grief is a journey that everybody takes at some point. Even the Savior knows what it's like to relate to people who grieve. And yes, every story of grief is different, but there are some common elements, and I want to look at those today so that if you're in a season of grief, or if you're still trying to recover from that, or someone you love is currently in that, you can do it in a way that's healthy and that doesn't crush you. So there are a few things to write down. If you have fill in the blanks, write these down. First is this: give yourself permission to grieve. Give yourself permission to grieve. I know that grieving stinks. I hate it. I've been through it, all different manners of it, and it can be heavy. And it's subtle. It just kind of rides along with you, but it just weighs you down. And I am the steady head when you should be panicking kind of guy. I'm the keep it all together guy. I'm the the steady, the one who's, thinking cerebrally. Okay. And it's easy for me in seasons when I should be grieving to say, I'm fine. Yeah, I had my moment. It's good. It's all good. But grief is something that you have to go through. And it's difficult as Christians. We don't want to go through it. And we read stuff like 1 Thessalonians 4:13, and it makes us think, well, maybe we shouldn't go through it. The Bible says this: we want you to know what will happen to the believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who have no hope. And it's easy to read that and come away with an understanding that says, well, grief and hope are like opposite forces, and you either have one or the other. I've been a pastor at some different level of full-time ministry for 18 years now. I grew up in church. And I know that a lot of people have said something like this, and maybe you have or a loved one has. Have you ever had someone say, well, I want my funeral to be a party. I want it to be a celebration. I don't want anyone to cry at my funeral. I'm going to be with Jesus. I want you all to celebrate. I mean, legitimately, we've had people before ask, I want fast, loud songs, and I want people cheering. And I understand the heart behind that, and it's not a criticism of that. It's well-meaning and well-intended, but it can produce some damaging consequences because grief is something that needs to happen. It's an emotional wound that has a process that you have to go through to heal. And if you don't allow yourself to feel those things, if you don't allow it to heal, it's like saying to someone, if you cut your finger, I hope it never scabs up. What happens if it never scabs up? It just keeps bleeding forever. Okay? I've told my family, okay? I expect you to cry at my funeral. If you don't, I will be very disappointed from heaven, okay? It's okay. You have to give yourself, sometimes you have to give yourself permission to grieve. It doesn't mean that you don't have hope. Look, we don't grieve like those who have no hope, but we do grieve. And write this down in your notes. Grief is a debt that has to be paid sooner or later. If you don't deal with it, it'll just keep coming back up until you do. And it's not fun. As a pastor, I've walked through people who are dealing with grief. As I used to volunteer with the coroner's office, listen, I showed up a lot of times in the middle of the night to someone's home right when they first got the news that someone they loved had died. And I know how difficult that process is. I've sat with people as they're in shock, as they're in disbelief. And if you've had those moments of grief, you know there's sometimes at first it's like, I feel like I'm in a dream. I feel like this isn't real. I feel like I'm an out-of-body experience. It's normal at times to say, I just keep thinking that I'm to turn around and Granddad's just going to come walking down the hallway and this was all a bad dream. But that fades pretty quickly. The sadness tends to linger a long time, and the other part that lingers a long time is anger. Anger is sort of a hallmark of the grieving process. We get angry at a lot of things. You might be angry at something that was done. I had a brother-in-law who died because of the actions that some irresponsible people took, and there was never justice there. And was angry. Sometimes you're angry at yourself because you think I could have done something different. Sometimes you're angry at that drunk driver who ran through the intersection. Sometimes you're angry at the doctor, but regardless of who you start being angry at, regardless of how close your relationship is with God, at some point in grief, we usually end up taking that fist and pointing it this way. And we see that in this passage where both of these sisters come to Jesus and they say, it's your fault. You could have prevented this. You could have changed this. You could have stopped this. You don't have that unless you have faith that God can do miracles. But if you've ever lost something that you loved, you probably had that moment where you say, God, I don't understand why. But that's part of the process of grieving. And I want you to notice something. Write this down. Jesus didn't rebuke Martha and Mary for their anger. See, I probably would have said, hey, hang on a minute. Who do you think you're talking to right now? Why don't you just tone down the sass, lady? Okay? Probably good that I wasn't the Messiah. Okay? Amazing patience. Jesus, he didn't stop them. He knew that he was going to raise Lazarus back from the dead. Lady, you're crying about nothing. He didn't do that. He didn't rebuke them for their anger because anger is part of the process. You have to give yourself permission to grieve. And as you do it, write this down, you need to give others permission to grieve differently than you. Because we all process this at a different way, in a different pace. We're all individuals and we're different in the way that we see the world. John 11:35, as Jesus wept, here's the very next verse. Okay, John 11:36, see how much he loved him, the people said. Okay. Why did they say that? Because we tend to infer somebody's feelings by the way that they express them. Jesus breaks down and cries. I mean, just consider that for a minute. He knew he was going to raise him back to life. And Jesus has this moment and he's weeping. And everyone says, wow, this was a really close friend of Lazarus. See how much he loved him? It's normal to gauge how someone feels by how they express their feelings. The problem is we express our feelings in different ways. We don't all walk through the process of grief the same way. We see that in the two sisters. Martha comes to Jesus and she comes alone. She probably was crying, but the Bible doesn't actually mention at any point that she was crying. She comes to reason with Jesus. Mary, on the other hand, okay, Mary, we see her, she's crying. She's surrounded by all the people and all the friends. And when she runs out to see Jesus, they all run out with her in this one big party. And not really a party, but one big group, okay? And she falls at his feet weeping, okay? Some people process grief in a very internal, private way. Some people process grief in a very loud and external and social way. It doesn't mean they feel differently. And I've seen this be such a sticking point for friends or for siblings or for spouses. Where it's easy for one to say, why can't you get yourself together? Come on, you're a mess. At some point you have to let it go and tough up. Or one looks at the other and says, did you even love him at all? I don't know how you're just okay with this. How are you not torn up right now? Well, I am. You don't know me. Okay. You have to give other people permission to grieve differently than you do. And you have to understand they may just be in a different part of the process than you are. Because write this down, grief comes in layers. Like ogres. Layers, right? Like onions have layers. Some of you guys know what I'm talking about. Listen, if you've ever been through the process of grief, you know this, okay? I thought I was good now. I thought I had already cried all the tears. And then you go through a box and you pull out something and it reminds you of, and the tears come right back and you say, I didn't know there was another layer to this. Sometimes you feel like, I think I'm out of the valley. I think everything's good. And then Facebook reminds you of a post that was posted 5 years ago and you see that video and it's like, okay, still more layers. And some people may process at a different speed than you do. You got to give people permission to grieve differently. Here's what I noticed about Jesus. When Martha came to Jesus, she spoke to him with reason and Jesus reasoned with her. He explained part of it. I didn't have all of it. You can go back and read the passage. They had a conversation. Okay? When Mary came to Jesus crying, Jesus cried with her. What does that tell me? Jesus validated their feelings. And he processed through it with them the way that they were processing it. Could you imagine? Okay, imagine like a 1930s, 1940s movie era Jesus where Mary is like crying and he picks her up and like, shh, get a hold of yourself, woman, snap out of it. Okay, not good, not good. That would have made the scriptures for sure. He was sensitive to how she was feeling in the moment. And he never said, hey, you're being ridiculous. Snap out of it. Allow yourself to grieve. Allow people to grieve differently. And finally, write this down. Allow the people who love you to share your burden. Allow them to share your burden. See, I've been carrying this the whole time. And grief kind of tends to linger with you, but it is heavy and it weighs you down. And if you try to carry it your whole life by yourself, it will wear you out. Many of you know I was a psychology major in college. I was trying to run from God's calling because I didn't want to be a pastor. And I learned some valuable things that ended up actually helping me as a pastor. Did you know this? You probably intuitively knew this, that many human emotions are sort of contagious. You see other people going through an emotional state and you tend to reflect that. It's really great with laughter. Do anybody have a friend who just has contagious smile and laughter? Anybody know that person? A few of you guys? My dad is that way. If you watch a funny movie by yourself, you chuckle. But if you watch it with Steve Clark, you laugh like 4 times as much. He just has a contagious laugh. Researchers have looked into this a lot. Do you know what the most contagious human emotion is? Sadness. Crying is more contagious than laughter. And you would think, man, that's a bummer. If God actually custom designed this species, why would he do that? Here's why. Because psychologists have also told us that the most damaging side effect to grief is isolation and loneliness. Grieving and feeling cut off from people are highly correlated together. And even when you don't want to, it just kind of naturally happens because people are grieving at a different rate than you are. Maybe they've moved on and you haven't, and it creates this weird dynamic, and you're like, well, they don't want to hang out with me. I'm just going to feel Debbie Downer. They don't understand what I'm going through. They don't know what this feels like. No one can relate to me. It's easy to be cut off. That's why it's so important that you intentionally allow the people around you who love you to share the burden of grief with you. Last week we looked at a passage from Romans chapter 12, verse 15, to rejoice with those who rejoice, and that's great. We want to do that. But equally important is the second half of that verse, to weep with those who weep. We're designed that way. We need that. And if grief is weighing you down or someone that you love, you need that social support. One more piece of research. Psychologists have looked at all of the different factors as someone is grieving, and what are the things that are the most beneficial? What are the things that change the most so that grief, if it must come, can come in a healthy way that doesn't do unnecessary injury to someone emotionally? You know what the single biggest factor is? It's not being alone. It's having support around you. It's having people to help to carry that burden of grief, whether it's someone who died, whether it's a dream that died, whether it's a place you feel like you're just feeling like hope has all exited the room. And I know it's difficult. Believe me, in my line of work, I go through this a lot. Sometimes you don't know what to say. You ever been there? Somebody's grieving, somebody you love, and you're like, I don't even know what to say. I don't have anything. I can only cook so many casseroles, okay? I don't have that many recipes. I do what I want. All of those, being around and saying stuff helps, and cooking stuff for people helps. You know what research shows the most valuable thing is, and you can write this in your notes, the biggest help is just being present. It's just knowing that somebody else is there. I've had times where I'll go and I'll sit with someone and there isn't anything to say. So I'm just there. And it's something about someone else being present and seeing you and caring that really makes the difference. I'm going to ask Elijah to come back up to the stage. As he does, I want to come back to that first shortest verse in the Bible, two-word thought, because this is where that verse is so powerful. It's easy to envision a God who's off in heaven somewhere, who already knows how things are going to end, who looks at us in our temporary lives and our temporary emotions and would say, Jerry, snap out of it. You're being ridiculous. Robert, just chill, man. It's fine. That's not how he responds. That's not who he is. There's so much meaning and so much importance when we read that Jesus wept because he was here with the people that he loved, carrying that burden along with them. He came to ease that. And you have to understand, we've looked at a lot of different burdens that we go through in our lives. And I know that I said in the first week, the trade-off, the great trade is that I take the heavy things and I give them to Jesus. And instead, I take his burden, okay, of just following him. And it is a burden, but it's light. And I hand all of the things off to Jesus and I say, Jesus, this is yours now. I don't want it anymore. You can have it. There's a clause. There's a difference. There's an exception when it comes to grief, because grief is something that has to process in order for you to heal. It's coming to an understanding of, how do I reconcile with the things I thought were going to be mine and they aren't anymore? How do I take these memories and have them not inflict pain anymore? How do I do this? I want you to notice that when David is writing about the journey of life, he doesn't say, the Lord leads me around the valley of the shadow of death. He says he leads me through it. And I would love, believe me, I've been in those times when it hurts so much. I just want to lock that feeling away. I just want to put that in the closet and say, I can't deal with this right now. I don't want to deal with it ever again. I've had times where I'm like, God, please just take this feeling away from me. I just need relief. But he's the one who's leading me through the valley. Now, the journey doesn't end in the valley. He is leading through it, but through that season is difficult, and it's not always a fast journey through the valley of the shadow of death. Sometimes it takes a long time. here's what's beautiful about that. David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you're with me. And that presence with you in the hardest moments of your life, that presence with you when you feel like, please God, let this be a dream. Please let this not be true. Please tell me there's a different way, that they misunderstood, that they misread the chart, that they sent the wrong message. Please, God, please, when you're in that moment. There's something so powerful from knowing that God himself is walking with you and he's weeping with you. The last thing to write down in your notes, and this is powerful, and I don't want you to miss this. I've messed this up before. Don't ask God to remove your grief. Ask him to help you go through it. So I want to ask him, God, take this away. But some things you have to walk through. Jesus didn't want to go to the cross. He said, God, there's got to be another way. And God said, son, there isn't another way. This is the only way. The path leads through a really dark place. And grief, I said in the beginning, is an inescapable burden. You're all going to face that. And some of you probably walked in today, you're still in that valley. Some of you, somebody who's close to you that you love, you know they're still in the middle of it. Some of you are looking at life and you're reading the patterns and you're saying, I'm preparing my heart now because I know this moment's coming. You dread that. And it is hard. But grief has to come so you can heal. The beautiful thing about a Savior who loves you and cares for you is that he does not turn back and say, hey, what's taking so long? Work harder. He turns around and says, let me help you with that. I know it's heavy. You don't have to do it alone. Lean on me. And the beautiful thing is that even if you're angry at him, he gives you space to feel it so you can get through it. So my friends, grieve when it's time to grieve. Cry and yell and wonder and reason and shake your fists at the sky if you need to process those things. Here's what you need to know. That when you're done beating your hands against the chest of the shepherd, and you've spent all of your energy, he'll still be there to hold you and say, it's okay. Let's cry for a little while, and we'll get back on the road. Don't walk through the valley of the shadow of death alone. Allow yourself to grieve and to feel it. And allow the people around you to help you. And allow the God who made you and who loves you to continue to guide you through it, because there is hope on the other side. Hey there, just wanted to take a minute to say thanks for watching. If a friend sent you this link, it's because they believe what we talked about today is going to make a positive impact in your life. And if it did, there's probably somebody that you care about who could benefit from it. So take a minute to share this video with somebody. Post it to your timeline or send them a direct link. And if you're able, take a minute to give using the link at the bottom of the description on this video. One last thing. Maybe you feel a tug at your soul and you're ready to take the next step in your spiritual life and form a relationship with God. We've got folks here who would love to talk with you about it. So just text prayer to the number on your screen and we'll follow up with you. It's also in the description on this video in case that helps. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.